Is the UK-led COP26 agenda making the energy crisis worse? Are fuel bills more expensive because they have to subsidise renewables? We're joined now in the studio by a friend of the show, economist and former director of the UK government's Economic Service. That's Vicky Price, former very senior diplomat. Always good to see you, Vicky. And joining us also remotely on whether or not the COP26 agenda is making the energy crisis worse is Tom Burke, who's chairman of E3G, himself a former government advisor on climate change. Tom, you're most welcome. Vicky, let's turn firstly to you. No one here is saying that there's not merit in the COP26 agenda. We're not talking about that. That's a completely separate debate. Some viewers may have opinions on that, but that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the more narrow economic question of whether pursuing this COP26 agenda, pursuing this net zero carbon target by 2050 with all the expense of it, is it making the current energy crisis more acute, in your view?
I think it has made that more acute across the world. And I have to say, first, what's happening in Europe, for example, where we've had a very cold winter, this last winter, also in the UK. And because, for example, Germany has abandoned investing more in nuclear, and because there has been...
After the Fukushima disaster.
Yes, and because there has been this great move to go to renewables as quickly as you possibly can, it has had mixed results in different countries, which meant that they're still, for quite a large part of their energy generation, relying on gas, which now they have to import increasingly from places like Russia. So it makes you considerably more vulnerable to changes in prices which are, to a considerable extent, outside your control, and relying hugely on imported fossil fuels, because you cannot rely on wind and solar being there all the time when you want it. So you need your base load. In the UK, it's a little bit worse in the sense that we have moved even more aggressively towards renewables.
Yeah.
So there are times when 50% of our energy demand comes from renewables. But of course, it depends on whether the wind is actually blowing and whether the sun is shining, which today it isn't, for example, and the wind isn't very strong. And
as I say, you are a very senior, formerly a very senior civil servant. You were often in the room, Vicky, at sort of policy-making moments when political imperatives were traded off against one another. I posed in my opening monologue the notion that the energy crisis means that the Treasury will have to be more honest about the cost of net zero 2050. There's been a long-awaited Treasury review of the cost. The government says, oh, it'll be 50 billion, but no one knows where that 50 billion number comes from. An awful lot of very credible people think it'll be a lot more than 50 billion. Do you think the current energy crisis will have an impact on what the government says and does at the COP26 summit?
I think it will. But of course, the rhetoric is going to be, let's move even faster towards renewables. It's quite obvious that we need to do that because look what happens if we haven't got them.
Okay.
Now, the cost of moving to them, the transition cost, is huge. And I think what we're now realising, we should have realised quite some time ago, is that, just because of the gas prices, but more generally, the fact that there are so many energy-intensive industries in the UK which are relying still on using quite a lot of fossil fuel, whether we like it or not. We've switched from coal, of course, to now gas, which has exacerbated the whole price conundrum that we're seeing at present. Now, those sectors, whether it's steel or cement, for example, are likely to suffer quite significantly. So the question is, it's not, what do we do with those sectors which are going to need support? So I'm suspecting that when we're looking at what the cost of the whole thing is going to be, that there will need to be considerable more working together with business and risk sharing. If you're going to be investing in all those new types of technology and energy efficiency, you're going to have to spend a lot of money, and private industry isn't going to be able to do it by itself.
Interesting. Let's bring in Tom Burke, chairman of E3G, as I said, himself a former government advisor on climate change. Tom, I think Vicky put her finger on something really interesting there. The gas crunch, the energy price spike may be used by the government to say, look, that proves that we need to move faster towards renewables, and yet that shift towards renewables involves subsidy, which is putting energy bills up, making the gas and energy price spike even worse.
Well, I agree that this is a very, very bad way to put a carbon price on, which is a favorite tool of economists for solving the climate problem. And I certainly wouldn't want to do it this way, because as in a sense you've made clear, that has a really bad impact on a lot of the people who are least able to bear it. But that all that means is you've got to get the policy right, which frankly the government isn't doing. I agree with what Vicky was saying about the importance of the geopolitical consequences of increasing our dependence on gas. She's absolutely right about that. The best possible way to do that, and the best possible way to reduce carbon emissions, is to do something a whole succession of governments have completely failed to do, and that's to improve the energy efficiency of our buildings. Most of the energy we use from burning fossil fuels ends up as waste heat anyway. So how on earth could you ever imagine that driving all that out, waste heat and carbon out of your system, would somehow damage your economy? It won't damage your economy. Now, do we have to invest properly in order to do that? Yes, we do. Do we have to invest in everything, which is somewhat the government's policy? No. The idea that, all of the above is a sensible way to deploy either public or private capital is a very, very bad idea, as I'm sure you appreciate. So you do have to make some real choices. First choice is to insulate homes. The second choice is to do renewables. And by the way, it's not right to say that renewables are now dependent on subsidies. Getting them to the prices they're now available at was, but you can now find offshore wind bidding into the market at around under £40 a megawatt hour, and the government's still proposing to go ahead and build another nuclear power station, which will come in at about £112 an hour. So if you really are, as you should be, concerned about what it's going to cost us to decarbonize, you need to be equally concerned about making the right decisions.
Interesting, Tom. Two things. You mentioned Insulate a couple of times, so I guess you think that the protesters, who my colleague Mark White was focused on at the top of the show, whatever you think of their methods, their message is actually correct. We should be insulating buildings. That's the first point I want you to respond to. The second point is you quibbled with me saying that renewables are subsidised. Yes, I agree with you. Well, I don't agree with you. It's just a fact, isn't it, that renewable prices are now competitive. But surely if you want to increase the capacity of renewables, you're going to need to put more subsidy in, because it's about building the capacity. That's the bit that generally has been subsidised in the past, rather than actually running those renewable sources.
Let me come to your second point, and I'll come back on Insulate UK. What the value, and it's a normal part of sensible economic policy, you have a lot of public investment in things that the private sector will then do better. And that's exactly what's happened on renewables. Early on in the process of making the change, there was a lot of public sector investment. Now you're finding that not just in this country, but all over the world, renewables are bidding into electricity markets under the price even of existing coal in places like India. So it's not a question of needing more subsidies. What you do need to do, which is very important, is you need to get the right design of your electricity system and the right regulation of that market. And we haven't got that right. And that's led to some of the reasons there's been underinvestment from the private sector in what are the marvelous opportunities of going forward on renewables. But if I come back to your point on Insulate UK, they have the right point, as you said. I'm not sure I understand what's achieved by going on making the same point over and over and over again. And I interpret the sort of commitment of those individuals being much more driven by their anxiety about the way in which climate change is going to change all of our lives and actually cause an awful lot more disruption than the protesters are changing, and the fact that governments everywhere, not just here, aren't moving fast enough to get the problem down. So I quite understand everybody's frustration with what they're doing. I'm not sure that on its own it will bring about change very rapidly, but we really do need to take the point, and government in particular needs to take the point very, very much more urgently than it's currently doing so.
Well, this discussion, apart from the contribution by my colleague Mark, has been three nerds talking about energy markets. And that's fair enough. We need to discuss these complex issues. But let's get the consumer's perspective now. Let's bring in the founder of the Energy Shop, an energy comparison website. That's Joe Malinowski. Joe, thanks a lot for joining us here on The Money. We appreciate you being with us. What are your thoughts for consumers as the nights draw in and the temperatures drop? The price cap has shifted, 1277, that's now the average household energy bill. Where do you see those energy bills going in the future, and what can consumers do?
As things stand in wholesale markets at the present time, those bills are going to be heading towards about the 1,750 mark. So we're looking provisionally at another £500 increase come next April. Every day that because of the way the price cap is calculated, it takes 12 months forward wholesale prices, 6 months back. Every day we are at these elevated levels clearly builds more and more pressure on the future increase. So right now we're in a pretty bad position. I mean, to put it into context, a year ago, the average bill was 1,042 under the price cap. Now it's 1,277. We are talking about it going towards 1,750. That's a 70% increase over the course of 18 months. It's going to be extraordinarily painful. Normally, clearly, being a comparison and switching site, I would be telling everybody, go out there, switch, get yourself a better deal. Right now, the market has ceased to operate. It's been turned on its head. There are no better deals than price-protected, price-cap products. But even you can't even, if you haven't got one, you can't even get one of those at the moment because nobody is offering them actually out for sale. You can be on one, you can't buy one. So for consumers, they fall as far as their energy broadly into three categories, as I would put it, in terms of what they can do right now. Firstly, if you're on a legacy fixed deal with a supplier that hasn't yet gone bankrupt on you, I'm not saying they all will, but the one that hasn't, then you're in a very, very good place. You are still enjoying the benefits of competition as they were, extraordinarily cheap energy pricing, well below current market-based pricing. Stay there. If you're on an SVT, price protect product, there's 15 million households. That is literally the best that you can actually do at the moment. Again, do absolutely nothing to be done there. Thirdly, if you are coming up for renewal, whatever you do not sign up to a renewal tariff with your current provider. The product's prices, there are some products being offered in the market at the moment, but they are simply outrageous in pricing. It's not that they reflect the likely direction of the price cap. They reflect the price cap plus a massive premium. I mean, we are talking products being offered at over £2,200, £2,300. You do not want to be convinced to sign up to anything. So if you're coming to the end of a fixed deal with your provider, ignore them. You get rolled onto the default tariff, and you will end up paying $12,077 for the time being. But bear in mind, it's going to go a lot higher come April. So the real message is you can't save any money by switching at this market. That's no longer an option. All you can do for the time being is take some serious steps into thinking how you're going to reduce your energy usage over the course of the coming winter.
Good advice there. Joe Malinowski, founder of theenergyshop.com. And to broaden the discussion even further, let's bring in Donica McCarthy, who's climate columnist for The Independent, a journalist I happen to admire. Donica, good to see you. Good to have you on GB News. Thank you for joining us. I don't know if you heard my opening statement at the top of the show. Maybe you feel I was being a little bit mischievous, if only for the benefits of discussion. Do you think that this energy price spike will influence the COP26 agenda? Do you think the COP26 agenda itself is making the energy price spike even worse?
No, there's no link between the COP conference and energy prices. What there is a link between is tackling the climate crisis and what the government has and has not done over the last 10, 15 years. There's two issues with the current immediate crisis that comes to mind. The government closed down the gas storage facility, which leaves us totally at the mercy of international market spikes like we are currently undergoing. The idea that we have no storage in the United Kingdom is a disgrace. And the second thing that the government did was it slashed billions off the insulation program, which means millions of poorer people are now facing a winter, as you rightly said, of fuel poverty and making the choice between food and energy and heating. So we are looking at failure by the government policies up to now.
I agree with you absolutely on the storage issue. Since the Rough facility closed off the coast of Yorkshire, I think we've basically outsourced our gas storage to France, Germany and Spain. The United Kingdom has, despite obviously being a major economy. But what would you say, Donica, about the irony of the fact that the Western world is now begging the OPEC energy exporters cartel, begging Vladimir Putin to pump more oil and gas, more fossil fuels, while engaging in lots of virtue signalling in Glasgow to decarbonize? There is at the very least an irony there, isn't there?
Absolutely. None of us want to see a spike in fossil fuel usage, which is what we're currently doing. One of the United Nations pointed out is, we're all talking about across the world about build back better. But what the governments around the world did is they poured billions into building back dirtier. They poured hundreds of billions of pounds into the old dirty economy rather than investing it into the new economy. And so that's leaving us more and more prone to spikes like this and to being held to ransom by Russia, which controls 50% of global gas reserves. It's a bonanza for them, and it's self-created. We had an oil crisis in the 70s. I don't know if you remember it, I certainly do. And what the action from then should have been was us to look at investing in energy efficiency and renewables so that we don't face a double whammy of being in hock to the oil suppliers and the climate crisis that's now coming down the road at us.
I do think, though, Donica, I do remember the oil crisis. I was a precocious and news-obsessed child. I do think, though, that the fact, I quoted some Ofgem figures at the top of the show. 23% says Ofgem of your energy bill, your utility bill is now going on environmental and social expenditure. Those expenditures will become much, much more visible, much, much more talked about, won't they? Much, much more politically controversial.
I think I just want to slightly correct that figure. Well, the 23% figure applies to 20% of our energy, i.e. our electricity bill.
Okay.
So actually our overall bills, if you combine the household gas, that £1,200 bill, there's around £110 of environmental taxes there. Well, what I would like to say is that has been investment over the last 10, 15 years in bringing down energy usage. And so the research shows that energy efficiency measures that have been taken over the last years, well, the condensing boilers, more efficient fridges, LED lighting, has reduced the average household expenditure by around £300 to £500 already. And that's something we often forget. You as somebody involved in money, you understand investment to save. So over the last 15 years, we have been making some investments in energy efficiency, and that's paying off now in reducing bills already by £300. So, for example, a fridge 10 years ago cost around £100 a year to run. My fridge now costs £18 a year to run.
Yeah,
that's a massive saving. That's invisible for householders. So this £100 is being invested in efficiency for poorer homes. And my worry is that if we cut that carbon tax, richer people, middle-class people, will not be will have a massive tax back refund from the government, and poor people will have their homes slowed down in insulation. That's my worry about if we cut it.
Donica McCarthy, The Independent, great contribution. Do come back on the show. I do want to talk to you more in the run-up to, during and after the COP26 summit. Let's go back briefly to Tom Burke, himself a former government advisor on climate change. Tom, do you think nuclear is at least part of a sustainable net zero solution? I know an increasing number of environmentalists do. Are you one of them?
No. I think it's an extraordinarily bad idea. Let me say it's a very interestingly bad idea theoretically as well, which you'll understand. In order to build a new nuclear power station at Hinkley Point, at the moment, the one that's under construction, the government had to buy 35 years worth of electricity at £112 a megawatt hour. Now, however you look at that, that's a very bad idea. Why would you want to do that again?
Modular nuclear reactors that Rolls-Royce are building. They don't cost as much, they don't need as much subsidy, they're more efficient, they take up less space, they're less controversial for planning purposes.
They don't exist. You can't buy one anywhere. You've got some designs that haven't even gone to the regulators to see whether they'd work or not. So you've got some great corporate PR going on out there, but you haven't got a serious energy option available. They're not small, by the way. They're 400 megawatts, which is the same size as some of the remains of our first nuclear program. So they're not small, and they're only modular if you build a factory. And you can't build a factory until you've got 16 orders. And you've got to be very heroic.
I'm going to leave it there. Good contribution. Do come back on the show, because I also want to bring Vicky Price in at the end of the discussion. Vicky, you've been very patient as always. What do you think of what you heard? I must say, we speak a lot. I was quite surprised at the top of the show that you do feel that the energy price spike is partly linked to COP26, and there'll be linkages between COP26 agenda and the energy price spike. What have you learned from that discussion with all our distinguished guests?
I think the first thing is that there is no doubt that we do need to move away from over-dependence on gas, but that in the meantime, we need to be quite clever about the policies that we put in place. And we have made lots of mistakes. The question is, can we get out of that in any sensible way so that we can pursue both the goal of ensuring that we don't plunge lots of people into fuel poverty, or poverty, period, given everything that everyone suffered through COVID, and B, how we can also support energy-intensive sectors in the right way. And if we make mistakes...
Steel makers, manufacturers, car makers.
Indeed. And
because there's no cap on business, is there?
No.
There's no cap on corporate bills for energy. Good point.
But again, a number of them may have hedged and bought ahead. So the bigger you are, the better it is, but it isn't going to last for any length of time. And obviously they hadn't anticipated this type of increase that, if it persists, is going to be pretty ruinous. So, but do we do the right thing in terms of the types of technology we use to ensure that we have clean energy in the future? And is nuclear necessarily the best option? It's reducing in size anyway for the moment, unless we build this extra plants that you're talking about, including possibly Sizewell C. But they are very expensive. They take a long period to come to fruition, if you like. And then they have the nuclear waste. And that's a big issue. And of course, in order to get it done, no investor would do it because it doesn't pay privately. You're going to have huge government involvement. Is it better to put the money there or to do something different in terms of the type of energy?
Complex issues we face. Vicky Price, former head of the Government Economic Service, friend of the show. Stay with us, because we're going to be having another debate in the next hour.